BWI Daily Edition, counting down almost to the single digits before Penn State fall camp. This is your training camp preview for the skill positions. I'm Thomas Frank Carr, host of the BWI Daily Edition, and I'm bringing in some reinforcements for today. Dave Eckert, writer here at Blue White Illustrated. Dave is our PFF guy. He, whenever there's a PFF article or whenever there's something that we talk about with data, he's usually the guy that takes the lead on it. And I've been using a lot of PFF stats and stuff in our training camp preview in lieu of video, which I prefer. So I'm bringing Dave on today. We're going to talk about the skill positions as we head into training camp. Dave, thanks for coming on with me today.
Yeah, I'm always happy to be here, T. Frank. Thanks for having me. I'm excited.
Yeah, so we are in the last couple days before training camp, and if you have not yet, check out the BWI Daily Edition. We've done quarterback, we've done offensive line, and now we're getting to the skill positions. So, Dave, your initial thoughts before we dive into some of the more interesting stats and data about this skill position as a whole. We're talking about running backs, tight ends, and receivers all together today. What's your general thought about that group of players?
I think Penn State has to feel pretty good, right? I mean, maybe at this time last year, there's a massive question mark in regards to Penn State's receivers that no longer exists, right? You have to feel pretty good about Penn State's receivers. Yep. You look at the running backs. I mean, there's just so many options there. We kind of talked about that the last time I was on. It's going to be very chaotic trying to sort that out in the spring. And then, at tight end, Penn State has some good options. Obviously, that's a little bit of a question mark with no Pat Freiermuth, but I think Penn State likes its options there. So I'm excited to kind of see the likes of Brenton Strange, Theo Johnson, Tyler Warren, really get to show us what they can do. So as a whole, I think Penn State fans should be excited. I think there's some really good athletes. There's some guys who maybe are a little bit raw and have some growth to do as maybe on the mental side of the game, but I think otherwise, there's plenty of reason to be excited.
That's been like the running theme for Penn State over the last 2 years or so of like, they're super talented, they're super young, but they're super talented. The way time works, at some point these guys aren't going to be young anymore, right? Like I'm right about that. Eventually they will have experience. How has it been that they've been so young? Even like into in 2020, we talked about how it could be this big monumental sort of national championship possibility run, but they were so young and inexperienced going into that season, and it doesn't feel like it's changed all that much, has it?
Yeah, not really. I mean, they have their veterans around, right? Like Jahan Dotson, obviously, last year Pat Freiermuth was maybe that guy. But you're right. It does feel like the cycle just keeps going and it never quite gets to where it needs to be for it to be that year, So, yeah, I don't know. I mean, there's this fun thing called the NFL draft and now this new fun thing called the transfer portal that tends to kind of mess with that. But, yeah, it's weird, and I could see how it would be frustrating for a Penn State fan, definitely.
So the one part that I think is interesting is that despite that youth last year, and I want to get into it now with some of the interesting things I pulled out of the data looking at the PFF stats. And again, if you want to check out the rest of what we talked about when we're talking about the youth on the Penn State offense, the offensive right side in particular is super inexperienced. So if you want to check that out, BWI on YouTube if you want to subscribe to that or wherever you get your podcast. But the receivers, despite that youth and inexperience, last year was one of their better years when it comes to a key stat that has plagued Penn State over the last couple of years, and that's drops. So total drops, because of last year and being so wacky, can kind of change a little bit. So I went by percentage of targets as far as what they've dropped, and I compared them to the other Big Ten teams in last year for 2020 and then the two previous seasons. Penn State was in the top 3 in terms of most drops in 2018 and 2019. Here are the numbers. They were just shy of 12% of their total targets were drops in 2019. That was third most. 2018. Remember back to 2018. That was the year KJ Hamler was a true freshman and Pat Fryermuth was a true freshman, I believe, as well. They dropped 14% as a team, not just those two guys, 14% of their passes as a team. That was the most in the Big Ten. So when you talk about inconsistency on offense over the years, yes, it's been the offensive coordinator. Yes, it's been that part. But when the ball has gotten to the receiver's hands, they have been inconsistent with coming down with it. Last year, with Jahan Dotson and Pat Fryermuth leading the charge, Penn State dropped just 6% of their passes. So over half reduction, 50% reduction, and which was fourth best in the conference. So when you look at 2020 and you're projecting into a new offense, is that something that you're thinking is going to stay stable, or with the new faces on the offense and some guys having to step up now that Pat Fryermuth has moved on, is that something that you think is going to fluctuate back in the negative way for Penn State?
I think it'll stay stable, right? I mean, obviously you get Jahan Dotson back, you have Parker Washington back. I think we're going to talk about it. But a guy like Keandre Lambert-Smith, who, is one of the guys who had a problem with drops. I mean, he was a true freshman, right? I mean, you would expect him to progress. So, from the wide receiver position, I feel like Penn State's fine there. Maybe there's a little bit of concern with some inexperienced tight ends. And maybe having some drops there, but they haven't shown me anything that leads me to believe that that's going to be a problem. It's maybe just us not knowing.
Would you consider? Sorry to cut you off. Would you consider Brenton Strange inexperienced at this point? Because that's one of those guys that when we talk about how young they are, he got significant time down the stretch last year, but really that was his first year, and he was kind of thrown into it. How do you view that position of, and I know we talked about this when it comes to training camp battles, is he inexperienced or is he experienced? He's like right on the line there.
I wouldn't call him young, but I would call him inexperienced. I think, so, obviously, I mean, he's been behind Pat Fryermuth, right? I mean, he hasn't been the guy. And granted, we don't necessarily know that he's going to be the guy. I think Theo Johnson might have something to say about that, and maybe even Tyler Warren. We don't know. But should he win that job at a camp, I think it's more than fair to call him inexperienced because he's never been the guy. So, obviously the time that he has had behind Pat Fryermuth has helped him. But, as far as him showing me what he needs to show in order for me to feel good about him, I don't feel like that threshold has been met yet.
Yeah. To your point, Penn State last year in 2020, when it comes to targets to the tight end, according to PFF, Pat Fryermuth was third. And remember, he didn't play for the second half of the season. Brenton Strange came in at 11th in terms of total targets at tight end in the Big Ten. So, to your point, experienced but inexperienced. How did you put it? He's not young, but he's inexperienced, so there's still a lot to prove. And again, that is as a receiver, not as as a total package, as a run blocker. So that's kind of that balance there between what I think is really important in finding that number 2 or number 3 receiver in the offense, and of course what the tight end brings as a receiver. And one of the things as a receiver last year, and this has gone back a couple of years now, is contested targets. So take us through the contested targets that Penn State had last year, and what did you see in that situation as well?
Sure. So obviously, if you look at some of the contested target statistics available on PFF, Jahan Dotson was third, Parker Washington was tied for fifth in the Big Ten, and Pat Fryermuth was ninth. So obviously, as far as guys making plays in those positions, Penn State did pretty well. However, I do think, maybe we can talk about it. I want to get your take first. There might have been some reasons for those contested targets that maybe aren't so good.
Right.
But yeah, again, it's good to know that you've got two guys returning with the ability to make those plays.
Yeah, so what's concerning to me is what you pointed out is that there are three guys in the top 10 in terms of number of contested targets. Now, you want to be good in those situations, right? Pat Fryermuth was top 10 when it comes to catching contested targets, the percentage he caught 8 of 12 last year. So that's great. And he's a guy that you're expecting as a tight end, not the fastest guy in the world, but a guy that's a tight end to get those contested catches and to make them. My biggest problem was that Parker Washington and Jahan Dotson were also in the top 10 when it comes to contested targets, and neither of them finished in the top 10. So you're throwing a lot of balls into jump ball situations, and you're not coming down with the majority of them. Now, that's not entirely on the receivers. And this is the kind of murky part and why I saved the skill positions for last, because what we covered in the last couple of episodes here on the Daily was Sean Clifford and the quality of the targets, especially the deep targets that he threw in 2020. They were not quality passes. So the receivers, this is the other side of it. The receivers were put in position where they had to make these tough catches or nobody caught the ball. That was kind of what happened with these contested targets, and Jahan Dotson did a good job. Parker Washington did less of a good job, but he did an okay job. Improving in this area, or, more importantly, throwing to open receivers is going to be a key for Penn State in 2021, and part of that does come down to the offensive coordinator being able to scheme up more open plays and take advantage of the defense. I think this is one of the biggest areas where we saw Mike Yurcich do a good job at Texas when it comes to the ability to get guys open. And that's going to be another part, Dave, is that when it comes to the deep receptions, Jahan Dotson is the only guy that had over 100 yards receiving on 20-plus yard passes last year. So big-time plays. Penn State lost all their big-time plays in 2020. I think we all painfully are aware. If you watch those games, there were some hard games to watch because there wasn't a lot of explosive playmaking ability on the offense. Do you think that some of that is going to return in 2021, or is that kind of the profile of what Penn State has at receiver and the skill positions and at running back?
Yeah, I mean, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Right? I think the offensive coordinator change, James Franklin said this, right? This isn't us inferring anything, was made with the goal to bring some of that back.
Right.
James Franklin was not happy with, the absence of explosive plays last year. He wants that to be his offense's identity, and we know that it wasn't. So, I do think that bringing in an offensive coordinator in Mike Yurcich, who's going to emphasize that, and obviously, as you pointed out, has some experience and some, expertise in creating those plays, is going to help Penn State. But, obviously, we're talking about the personnel here. So if you look at the personnel available, you love Jahan Dotson, right? You love Jahan Dotson's ability to do this. That's not up for discussion, I don't really think. But then you look at a guy like Parker Washington, who, I don't know if maybe it just didn't register with me, about not being in the stadium last year, but I mean, he's big. Like he weighs more than I think we tend to realize.
He's
Penn
thick.
State's biggest wide receiver.
Yeah.
So, he's and that's by a lot. He's 212 pounds. He's 5'11", 212 pounds. He's up 7 pounds from last season.
Yep.
So, again, is he a guy that's going to create a ton of separation down the field? And maybe I don't know. I don't know if that's the profile that he has. So, then you kind of look at guys like Keandre Lambert-Smith, right? I mean, certainly he's got the athletic profile to do that. But, again, we didn't really see it. Can your tight ends do that? I think they can, but again, we didn't really see it. So, it's gonna be interesting because I don't think there's an obvious second option there. Especially in the passing game. Yeah.
So just by PFF grades, if you're curious, Parker Washington finished with a 68.7 PFF receiving grade, which in the Big Ten, I'll pull that up here quickly. Forgive me for doing this live on air. That was 16th in the Big Ten last year. And for Penn State fans that thought he was really impressive, this is one of the areas, and that's why I wanted to highlight the contested catches. It was one area that he improved on over the season, but overall he did not perform well in. And I remember doing a couple of the film breakdowns you saw from week 1 where he goes into the red zone, and he was supposed to be a red zone threat. He was the slot receiver. Line up there 95% of the time. And you got to have those contested catches over the middle in the red zone. As you mentioned, he's a thick dude, so he can handle the contact over the middle. Maybe not the biggest guy in the world, but he can handle it. And he dropped a bunch early in the season, drops and not making those catches. And then by the end of the season in the Rutgers game, I remember he had really one good contested catch right between the safety and the corner, and he caught it for a touchdown. So that's the area to me when you're talking about progression from Parker Washington, one of the areas that you're going to see him improve, and that's where he does need to improve for it to have more production. And then obviously if you're into the PFF grades and stuff like that, his grade will go up from those plays like that, because I think he made the routine plays pretty well. He was able to get, the RPO slant in the slot where somebody's 10 yards off of him, if you remember the Michigan game, and then break a couple tackles and go for 20-some yards. Those easy catches, it was the next level stuff that Parker Washington, if you watch his highlight tape from high school, he's absolutely capable of. But you need to see, and not even just his highlight tape from high school, you saw the high-end plays at the end of the year last year, that consistency and what you talked about from not being a freshman anymore. I think that's going to be a key part of that for him improving and being that number 2 guy. Another thing that I'll be interested to see how Mike Yurcich does this is motion. Now, this is an area where we've talked a lot about this offseason of guys moving at or pre-snap, not just lining up in a static set of a 2x1 or a 2x2 or, 3 guys and 2 slot receivers to one side. There's more movement in this offense. But does that correlate to guys lining up at different positions? Is Jahan Dotson going to line up in the slot more? He lined up there less than 10% of the time last year after being a slot receiver early in his career. So that's going to be an interesting thing about the splits of where guys are lined up. Are you trying to get mismatches from your skill positions? That's another area that I think Mike Yurcich can have an effect on this group, and where they can kind of take a step forward when it comes to production, because that's really what Penn State has needed from that group, is that separation. But I don't think that they've been getting a lot of help. It's either you beat your guy, or Sean Clifford is staring into 3 guys with corners all over him, and he has to dump the ball down, or he has to scramble and run for a couple of yards. Do you think that's going to be an area where that Mike Yurcich actually does a little more multiplicity in putting guys in good situations to succeed from an alignment standpoint?
Yeah, I think so. Look, I mean, if I'm a Penn State fan and I'm looking at, I'm thinking about what I'm hoping to see from this offense, creativity like that is at the top of the list, because I really don't feel like I saw that last season. I saw, as you kind of alluded to, like, beat your guy one-on-one and make a play, or we're gonna run the ball and we're gonna grind it out. So it's tough to kind of predict something like that without seeing it, but certainly I think that's on the table. And again, we know Mike Yurcich is a guy who's going to get creative. He's a guy who's going to express some of his own ideas. He's not a guy who's going to be content to just keep it simple. So, motion, multiplicity, certainly, some of the things that he can employ to make that happen. But, I guess it's good. It's going to be something that we're going to have to wait and see on for sure.
Dave Eckert, BWI writer, with me here. We're doing our training camp preview of the skill positions. I'm your host, Thomas Frank Carr. We're talking about receivers, tight ends, running backs, the guys that are going to be catching the ball from Sean Clifford in 2021, and will they as a unit take a step forward? This is an area that I think a lot of people are expecting the answer to be yes, because we saw some really impressive things from this group last year, especially the young guys, as we've covered with Brenton Strange and with Parker Washington. Theo Johnson is a guy who, if you look at the testing numbers this offseason, have been nuts. just absolutely nuts. So we're trying to parse out, and this is the part that I think is really interesting, why I've highlighted some of the things like contested catches and separation and stuff like that, because it's hard to kind of parse out what is their responsibility and what's the responsibility of the quarterback and the offensive play caller. And another part that I want to get to, we've kind of discussed the receivers and tight ends, but we haven't really gotten into the running backs yet. And we've talked about, are you going to go thunder and thunder? Are you going to bring the elephant herd with Keyvone Lee and Noah Cain? Last year, Keyvone Lee, when it comes to, he was the team's top rusher, 90 attempts, 422 yards, but 13th in terms of explosive yards, percentage of plays on yards gained on big runs. Dave, can you do that? Can you have both of those guys in the backfield who are big physical bruising backs?
It's, yeah, you know, again, I don't really know that you can, but if you look at, you know, the options that Penn State has, I don't really know that there is a great change of pace option, you know. You look at guys like Bevan Ford and Keziah Holmes, right? I mean, maybe that's where they fit in, but again, if you're looking at the running backs that Penn State had out there last season, you know, those were the guys, not the guys that had you the most inspired. So again, you know, there was a little bit of a give and take there. I thought it was interesting that, you know, obviously they add John Lovett, and you know, that tells you that, hey, we feel that he's going to bring something that we don't already have. So, you know, it'll be interesting to see what that is, kind of when that plays out. Maybe he's the change of pace guy. I don't know. I don't think he's, you know, a stereotypical like third down back, right? I think he caught the ball 9 times last season, and that was his career high.
He had a weird year last year. He was kind of phased out of the Baylor offense.
Yep.
When I went back and I looked at everything, I was expecting him, and that's probably why he left, is because he didn't get an opportunity after 2019, where he was kind of working his way towards the lead back, and then he got leapfrogged by a couple guys on the roster. I think you're right to point him out as the explosive option, because in 2019, when he was that change of pace back, he was third in the Big 10, or excuse me, in the Big 12 in terms of explosive percentage. And that's what we're talking about here, is the amount of yards you gain on big plays, because Penn State needs to have more big plays in 2021, and we're trying to find here in the skill positions who's going to do that. Because you're right, the only other guy, and the guy I keep coming back to, is Keziah Holmes, because he's 5'11", 209, 212 pounds, somewhere in there, so he's got the profile of a guy who's really fast. Fastest guy in the state of Florida as a freshman. And he's now got the size to break tackles, but really he has yet to consistently put it together. You've seen some flashes, but we haven't seen it consistently. And if you're bringing in a senior like John Lovett at a position where you already have that many players, to me that tells me that's what they're looking for, is that explosive back, the guy that can not just get 7 yards and fall forward for 2 more. It's a guy that gets 9 that are there, and he's fast enough to get 15 or 17 to split the safety and to get big plays. So that's kind of what we're talking about here, and John Lovett is that guy. The number 2 returning rusher for Penn State, by the way, do you know who it is?
Sean Clifford?
It is Sean Clifford. That's exactly right. So you should be terrified. And I think probably coming in third is Will Levis. So despite that, you know, despite the number of talented rushers they have, that's what they have returning. And if you're saying, okay, so Noah Cain was a really impressive freshman in 2019, he was 25th when we're talking about explosive plays. So he was 25th in the Big Ten in 2019 in terms of yards gained on explosive plays. And that's not to say that if you don't have that, you're useless. But it is a facet that Penn State has to find in their offense in this coming year. One last thing, Dave, that I want to mention when it comes to the running backs is this is another area we might see more of an influence from Mike Yurcich. What does the data say about his ability to generate big plays for the running game as well, not just for the passing game?
Yeah, well, you know, you don't have to back that quickly. Obviously, we all know that, or that far, excuse me. We know that, Bijan Robinson is an incredibly talented player who he had at Texas last year. But again, he was a young player, and under Mike Yurcich, he led the Big 12 in yards and explosive plays. So, you've got a guy, you've got an offensive coordinator that knows how to do that. So again, there's going to be hiccups, I think, in year one. I don't think it's going to be perfect, but you've got a guy who knows how to do that, so it's going to come down to the personnel. To me, I think, to me, I guess the way that I've kind of been operating this offseason is I have a pretty high level of confidence in Mike Yurcich's ability to develop a scheme that's going to work for Penn State. To me, the variables kind of align more with the personnel. I don't know if that's the right way, but I've seen what Mike Yurcich has done at some of the other places that he's been, and that's just kind of the mindset that I've taken based on that. So again, it's going to be, does Penn State have the option, a guy who can be the right option to do that? I don't think there's an obvious choice. But, again, I think there's a guy in charge of the offense who can make that happen.
I think that's a really good point, and I want to underscore that with something interesting I found. But first, Dave, the 2021 Penn State football preview issue is here. We're previewing it right now, but if you want to get more content than this, if you want to get the hard, physical, tangible thing you can put your hands on, let me see if I've got it right here. I do. The 2021 Penn State football preview issue here, 166 page full color magazine. How long were you working on this, Dave? How long was this taking you? Because I know this is 100% your effort, right? You did all of this.
It's probably about 2% my effort, if I'm being totally honest. But there were some hours put in. But yeah, our magazine editor Matt Herb did a really good job. It looks great. I've got some hot takes in the back of that thing for you there if you want. Give us a little preview of addition and subtraction. You literally have the last word in the magazine, so give us just a little preview of what people can find in the Penn State football preview. Exactly, we're previewing the preview. It's just a little bit of a give and take on what Penn State gained, what Penn State lost in the transfer portal, and I kind of use numbers to assign a number to each transfer as far as like an impact rating, and use those impact ratings to come to a verdict that I won't spoil. But yeah, definitely I had fun with that. So an interesting read for sure. Well, make sure you check it out. It's the 2021 Penn State football preview issue, and it's the comprehensive guide to Nittany Lion's upcoming season, because you got stuff like the addition and subtraction, and maybe some addition by subtraction or some subtraction by subtraction. Well, you have to go find out in the magazine. It's packed with exclusive content like that, including interviews, features, opinions, and analysis. Learn more at bluewhiteonline.com or by calling 800-421-7751. That is Dave's personal cell phone number. 800-421-7751 or bluewhiteonline.com. Obviously, I'm lying. You have an 800 number. That would be ridiculous. What I want to do is I want to underscore your point of what Mike Yurcich can do as an offensive coordinator, because Texas didn't have good talent last year when it comes to their skill positions. He was able to elevate a group with Sam Ehlinger that I think we all agree is kind of an okay quarterback. He's Tim Tebow-esque when it comes to his throwing motion and his accuracy. He's better than that, but like he's definitely an athlete playing quarterback that learned to be a good college quarterback.
So he's a future Jacksonville Jaguars tight end? Is that what you're trying to tell me?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
Maybe a New York Mets outfielder as well.
Do not get me started. We'll have another whole podcast on the freaking overrated stuff about Tim Tebow. Like, you just get that opportunity because you're Tim Tebow? Like, that's great. Yeah, take the roster spot of some 17-year-old trying to make their dream come true. You're taking a second bite at the... I got into it. I wasn't going to get into it.
You did.
The Texas receivers. Let me just tell you how this breaks down. In 2020, their top pass catcher was Brennan Eagles. And again, if you are into the PFF grades, he would have ranked 15th in the Big Ten in terms of his receiving grade as a receiver in the Big Ten. He's a big-bodied possession sort of guy, but Texas didn't have a Jahan Dotson who was a top 5 receiver in their conference. They don't use tight ends. They didn't have a tight end with the talent of any of the guys on Penn State's roster. And I think maybe their running backs were a little more stable, but comparable talent. And with that, Texas still threw for the second most yards in the Big 12 last year. Now, nobody was even close to what Oklahoma did with like 3,500 yards, but they led the pack with 2,795, almost 2,800 yards passing. For the pandemic season, being number 2 in that conference, and with that group in the first year, I think that's really encouraging. So you're right. His ability to do that with better talent should equate to more production on offense. And if that does, that changes the whole outlook for Penn State football heading into 2021, and why I think both of us are really high on the Penn State offense and Mike Yurcich and what he can do with them. Last thing, and I know this is kind of a downer, but I really do want to get to this. Not a downer, but like we came off a high note there. We're kind of coming down to like a running back usage in the passing game. To me is another thing that I think a lot of people have talked about. Do you care? Do you care if Penn State uses their running backs in the passing game?
Yes, I
do. You do? Okay.
I do. And you, by all means, correct me if I'm wrong, because you are the expert here. But I think it's a valuable asset, and I think it's also something that maybe can offset a little bit of the quarterback running that's been going on too. Because if you look at the guys behind Sean Clifford this season, that those aren't guys that inspire too much confidence. They're young. They haven't played. Penn State needs to keep Sean Clifford healthy at all costs, to me. Yeah. So, if you can use the passing game with your running backs as maybe a little bit of a way to offset the just repetitive quarterback runs that we saw a lot last year, I think that's a good option. But yeah, it's going to depend on if Yurcich feels like he has the right options to do that. I don't really know that there's an obvious one available. I think Keyvone Lee actually was pretty good catching the football, but I don't know if his athletic profile is like that's a guy that I want to get in space and he's going to make something happen. It's going to be interesting to see what he does there. I think Keziah Holmes could be a good option. I think Devin Ford's a good option, but those aren't. If you think about the 3 guys that are going to be, Penn State's main guys, or maybe the guys that we associate as being, the most talented and the most ready to produce, those 2 guys aren't really there. Those aren't the guys that we're assuming are going to be, the big options. So it's going to be interesting to see if Yurcich can kind of find that balance and find his guy in that area of the game, because I don't think there's an obvious choice.
Yeah, and to underscore your point, I'm less concerned about the running backs in the passing game. But when he did not have a mobile quarterback with Mason Rudolph, I think it was in 2017, the running back that year at Oklahoma State did have 40-plus targets in the passing game. So you're right, it can be an outlet for letting off some of the steam in that running quarterback sort of situation. To me, the problem with running the quarterback is not the hits. It's not it's the number. It's not even the number of times. It is when you do it. So last year, and this is gonna bring up a couple of things that I really think were the downfall of Kirk Ciarrocca, was when they got inside the 10-yard line, it's the only thing they would call. And like the point. Yeah. The point of running the quarterback is the numbers advantage. But you lose that if everyone knows that you're going to run the quarterback. So down in the red zone, everyone's at the line of scrimmage. There is no real advantage. You have to create space. All of those advantages of having 2 deep safeties and threatening deep, and then the box is open for you to run, when you're down inside the 5-yard line, that doesn't really exist anymore. And this has been my feeling when it comes to the quarterback run game in general. When you start leaning on it and leaning on what it can be as a cheat code, it means you're not taking advantage of other, more efficient means of moving the football. It's a crutch. It is, okay, we can't throw the ball. So, or we can't get anything deep, so we need to find some way to threaten the box count so they'll get guys out of the flat. So we're going to run the quarterback 4 times in the first half. And that's when you get into those situations where the quarterback is taking unnecessary hits because he's running into traffic as if he's a running back. So if he's on the perimeter and he can there's space, and there's games like against Iowa, I think of when I think of like good quality attempts where Penn State was able to threaten on the edge, and they were able to, this is 2019 I'm talking about, where Sean Clifford ate up yards on the outside. It was because the defense was keying on the running back, and that's how it's supposed to work. You're not running it as a last-ditched effort to get yards in a cheap sort of way. I don't think you're going to see that with Mike Yurcich. I think he's been much more judicious with how he runs the quarterback. He's still going to, but I don't think he's going to lean on that in particular when it comes to, we need to get a first down, we're going to run the quarterback. There may be some of that, but he's going to have a plan of, okay, we have a play for this situation. There were times last year, and there have been times in the past where it felt like Penn State didn't have a good play or a good plan, so let's run the quarterback because that's always the numbers thing. And I that's where I get off the bus with the quarterback run game. But I don't think it's as dangerous or it's as much of a problem as Penn State fans think it is. It's just the way it's been used over time. I understand why people have a negative opinion of it.
Sure. Yeah, definitely. I think last year it was out of control, frankly. So,
yeah.
Yeah.
The stat I always come back to is the only teams that ran the quarterback more, if you combined Clifford and Levis when it comes to designed runs, we're talking I think Air Force or Army. So, like, there's only one other team, and they're a true triple option team. So that's what you were watching last year. You were watching basically triple option football. That's what Penn State had to devolve to when their quarterback couldn't operate the offense and things weren't going well. That's what they devolved to. We're not going back there. Like, we're not going to have to watch that again. As the viewing public, I would bet just about anything that we're not going to be watching that. So that's our preview of the Penn State offense. I'd like to thank Dave Eckert for coming on and joining me here on the BWI Daily Edition Training Camp Preview. Dave, thanks so much for diving into the numbers and making this more interesting than if I were just shout at the camera for 20 minutes.
I'm happy to shout at the camera along with you anytime you will have me on. So
Thanks. Fantastic. Thanks so much. We'll be doing this again here on the BWI Daily Edition. And as always, I'm sorry, Dave. And this is like a Lord of the Rings episode where I'm about to wrap up and we're about to wrap up and we're about to wrap up. One more thing. What do you have at Blue White Illustrated right now? BWI.rivals.com. What's up there that people can find from you?
So right now, we've got some hoops content, which... Yeah, we got Micah Shrewsbury for about half an hour earlier this week. So Nate Bauer and I both got some stories there. I'm kind of doing like a series where I break down like how the various position groups came together from a recruiting standpoint and kind of look at them moving ahead as well. So I've got the latest edition of that. I think it's the linebackers, so that's up as well. That series is going to wrap up with the defensive line sometime this week, so be on the lookout for that.
Thanks so much, Dave. This is the BWI Daily Edition. Subscribe on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts.